Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Tony Gives channel. I just left the incredible documentary Paul McCartney Man on the Run, and I have so much to say. I am so happy about this. So first, to start off, the film is about Paul McCartney and his journey in the band Wings in the '70s. Now, Paul is the main star of the film, of course, and that's important going into this film. While he does focus on the other members of Wings, besides him and Linda, he's the main star here. And that's one of my main critiques of the film. Well, not really critique, but I do wish it focused more on the other members of Wings. But anyway, it starts off. There are the Wings right there, the Wings logo. It starts off when Paul has just left the Beatles in late '69, and he's in his farmhouse in Scotland and doesn't know what to do, and people think he's dead because of the hoax, of the Paul's dead hoax. And then the film flashes back 8 months earlier when Paul married Linda, and it focuses on Paul's depression when the Beatles just broke up, and he was in the farm with Linda, with her and her daughter Heather, and their daughter Heather, and really goes into how Paul was feeling at that time, trying to decide what to do and how to move forward. And then, of course, had someone install a console for recording, and that's when he started making his first solo album, McCartney. And the film did mention that when the album came out in '70 in April, it got really bad reviews, and of course that was because people blamed Paul for the breakup, because he was the first one of the four of them to declare the band was broken up publicly, even though John broke up the band. And that's mentioned in this film. I love that Paul finally says that. I love that so much. It's so great that in this movie, Paul finally says he did not break up the Beatles, John did. I remember in 2022, there was this radio interview where Paul said, John broke up the band, it wasn't me. Finally, that message is getting out there loud and clear. Finally. But anyway, it's mentioned in the film that while the record did sell very well, rightfully so, this album McCartney, people didn't love what they heard because they were expecting an album like the Beatles made. But you can't really expect that. This is Paul by himself. It's not the Beatles. I remember being 15 years old, and I love Paul's first solo album. I don't care that's not the Beatles. It's really great music. I'm not going to compare that to the Beatles, obviously. That would be silly. But that album is just, it's wonderful to me. And then in the film, it's mentioned that after that album, he wanted to go back and do a proper band album. And that's why he went to New York and made Ram. And that album gets a lot of great praise in this movie. You see a little bit of footage of Paul with his two young daughters in the studio, and Denny Seiwell's there. Now, I would have liked more interviews from the guys in Wings in this film. It was nice hearing from them in this movie, but I wish we got more of them. We didn't really get an introduction to Denny Seiwell that was proper. We didn't get that. But he did speak about how much he loved playing with Paul in the movie. Of course, he was there from the Ram sessions until he quit in '73. And again, another issue of mine, it wasn't really discussed about, it was ignored why Denny Seiwell and Henry McCulloch quit the band. Paul just says, oh, they suddenly quit. No, they quit because of you, Paul. But you don't want that in your film, do you? It was the same issue with this book, that he just ignores that issue. Henry McCulloch was frustrated with Paul because he didn't give him freedom to play the guitar parts he wanted to play. Denny Seiwell was frustrated because they weren't getting paid a good wage, and because when when Henry McCullough quit, Denny Seiwell told Paul to give him time, to give the band time to get a new guitar player and rehearse. Paul said, "No, I don't want to do that." That's why they quit, but it's not mentioned in this book, and it's not mentioned in the film. Anyway, I loved all the parts in the movie about the Ram album. There was even something I never saw before, a little excerpt from this play I heard about called Paul, Ringo, John, and Bert, this fictional comedy play about the Beatles breaking up. That was quite funny. And then we find out how Paul knew Denny Lane from the Moody Blues, and they show a clip of the Moody Blues on this TV show. Of course, he joined the band when they first formed in '71, and then they were together for starting in '71 for the album Wildlife, or as I call it, Wings Wildlife. It was the first Wings album. Now, again, another issue I have with this film: Wildlife, the album, is barely mentioned in here, if at all, barely. But I think it's such an important album because it was the first Wings album. So that was a bit frustrating. But then the next part of Wings that we see is about the 1972 Wings tour in Europe. And you hear a bit about how they started going off to colleges to play because Paul wanted to get back to the basics of being a band. And the band would go off to colleges just unannounced and say, "Hey, Paul McCartney is here." And people thought it was a lark. They thought it was a joke. And what's wonderful in this film is hearing from Mary McCartney and Stella McCartney, who were there as young little girls with their parents on this tour bus, which must have felt so magical to them. And again, another issue I have with this film is that it ignores the fact that in '72, Paul and the band recorded and released 3 singles. It's just completely ignored here. Hi, 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 Give Our Members to the Irish, and Mary Had a Little Lamb. Mary Had a Little Lamb is mentioned in here, but they mentioned the music video of Mary Had a Little Lamb. And of course, Henry McCullough and Denny Seiwell and Wings kind of hated making those videos and that song, because it is a bit embarrassing for guys who were excited to be in a rock band to play Mary Had a Little Lamb. And they did talk about the 1973 TV special, James Paul McCartney. It was really fascinating hearing Paul talk about that, present day Paul and Paul back then, seeing him. I've seen that special probably twice in my life, and the cringiest part is the gotta sing, gotta dance scene. But it's a nice special. It's worth watching because of all the music videos in there. And you see Paul with his family in his pub. And then, of course, the film goes into the Band on the Run story and the lore. Paul saying that he really wanted to make an album in an unconventional place. So he wanted to find out where EMI had studios. And they had a studio in Lagos, Nigeria, Africa. And it was a shit studio. Not like Abbey Road Studio at all. Jeff Emmerich, the Beatles engineer, was there with him. And there were spiders. And Fela Kuti, this Afro-pop musician who thought Paul was there to steal the black man's music. He was definitely not. Paul was not was not doing that at all. And Paul tells a story again about how him and Linda were out late one night and they got robbed of the tapes they had, and Linda was shouting, Don't kill him, he's a musician. Now, Paul loves telling that story, but at that point, they were already almost at the end of making the album. So it's not as though they had to make the album from scratch again. It's not. But anyway, this is the part of the story where they finished the Band on the Run album, and then it's a huge success, and Paul says in the film that he would have been happy even if Family Room was not a success. But I think that's him just revising history right there. I really think it is. Now, the next part of the film focuses on 74, when Wings have to regroup and rehearse and find two new band members. And this is where we see excerpts from the One Hand Clapping documentary from about 2 years ago, which is fascinating to see that that's already being repurposed here. That was cool to see. Of course, we saw them performing Soily in One Hand Clapping. And we were introduced to Jeff Britton, new drummer, and Jimmy McCulloch, new guitarist for Wings. I thought it was hilarious that Paul or someone said, now we got Jeff Britton instead of, well, later on, 2 years in the future, he mentions that Joe English is in the band, but not Jeff Britton. And Jeff Britton is English, but Joe English is American. And then the focus on the film was all about the 75 World Tour, which Paul was very nervous about, and he took great care to rehearse for that tour. And I really enjoyed the live footage of Wings live in that year. It was footage that we know well from the rock show documentary, concert film. And it was really cool to see Ringo Starr backstage with Paul. And then they show a sign that says band members only, but Ringo was right there. Oh, and earlier in the portion of the film about 71, they discussed John Lennon a lot and his album Imagine, with the infamous song How Do You Sleep, where John was attacking Paul. Now, my take on that song has always been that wasn't really John criticizing Paul, it was John criticizing himself. But people always thought it was about John attacking Paul. But I did like that we had Paul saying, how do I sleep? Oh, very well, thank you. That's the right response. One of my favorite parts of this film was the interviews from Sean Lennon himself about his dad and Paul. All those quotes are in this book. And it's amazing to me that Sean Lennon knows Paul so well. And I'm sure it's because as a little boy he heard his dad talk about Paul and probably met him years later. I mean, those two should be great friends, right? Come on, it's like he's Uncle Paul. Sean has a lot of great insights. And he revealed in the book and in the film that his dad listened to every album by Paul. Isn't that amazing? And then the film focuses on 76, on Paul and the band are on tour. And I love the little encore footage of Paul doing Yesterday when he starts off joking and he's doing some silly thing. And then we find out about the time John and Paul were at John's apartment, and then Warren Michaels and on Saturday Night Live offering the Beatles a chance to be on the show, but they just don't want to go do it at all. I can't imagine what it must have been like for people back in 76 to watch TV and see that. And then it goes to about the next year, and we see a little bit of footage of the band rehearsing and recording the One in Town album on this beautiful little boat. And of course, Linda was pregnant at that time. And I gotta say, for a pregnant Linda, she looked gorgeous. Linda was always a natural beauty, and this film did her so much love. Linda is just shown so much love in this film. I want to go back to that a little bit. And I used to think, I don't know why, but years ago I thought that Paul like begged Linda to be in the band Wings with him. But of course, in this film, we find out that he just asked her one night, "Hey, if I start a band, you want to be in it?" And she said, "Yeah," and that was it. There was no begging. I don't know why I thought that before. And Linda didn't have any professional musical training like Paul and the Beatles, so he had to really teach her, and it was not easy at all. But I think Linda has owed that love. It's really, really unfair how Linda was treated by the press back in the 70s. It was, I mean, you could say it was even worse than the kind of press Yoko faced. I mean, it's close to that kind of hate. Sometimes it was borderline sexist, but it was just mean. And she took it on the chin. She took her lumps, as they say. And you could see in this film that through the many years of being in Wings, Linda got tired of it and just wanted to relax. And that's why I'm sure she was happy when Wings broke up in the 80s. But I really liked the footage of Paul rehearsing for the One Town album. We saw him singing More Smooth Than the Grey Goose at the very beginning when he was working on the song. That's one of those great Wings songs that's so goofy and silly. Oh. And then we heard from Steve Howe and Warren Stuber, who joined Wings in 78, the last iteration of Wings. And it is fascinating that Paul said in the film that the third version of Wings with Joe English and Jim McCulloch and Denny Lane, that was the best version of Wings to him. Now, it probably has to do with the fact that they didn't really cause many problems for him, and Wings were at the peak of popularity at that point. I think that might play into it, but I don't argue with that at all. I think that was a fantastic version of the band for him. I really can't pick a favorite. But that was the part of the film where I got kind of nervous because Lawrence Stuber and Steve Howe were in the last part of Wings. So I was like, oh no, now the film is ending soon. That's so sad. But that was where the film focused a bit on Back to the Egg, the final Wings album, which of course Paul always thought was such a terrible album because it sold pretty poorly. But if you look back on it, it didn't sell that poorly. It was in the top 10 on the album charts, which if you're Paul McCartney seems bad, but if you're any other band, that's great. And I wish I could get him to not see that. I wish I could change Paul so he's not so insecure. If you just forget about the popularity and the charts and all that, Back to the Egg is an awesome album. But you see a music video for the Air Through Me song and Linda and Paul in that one, and it really shows their love. And I love how someone said in the film that Linda was not the greatest keyboardist and wasn't the greatest singer, but she was in the band with Paul because they were so great together and they were so in love. But then we get to the very tragic, unfortunate part of the film, the last Wings tour, the last Wings concert in 79, where Paul felt really bad about the show, felt like it was his worst concert ever. And I read about this before, but we finally saw this footage that Paul had this robot-like thing on that tour named Roby, and he would have the robot on stage doing some kind of song, playing music. It seemed very weird. It looks very weird. Maybe that was part of why Paul thought it was such a bad tour and bad show. But you can tell that Linda was excited for the final Wings tour because she was tired of performing live and going out. She just wanted to be a homebody. It was so wonderful to see Linda and Paul's kids, Mary and Stella, and I wish Heather was in the film more. I do. Heather is just so unnoticed. We don't hear much about Heather in this, and we don't. Yeah, Heather has been completely out of the public eye for the past 25 years. But anyway, yeah, Paul talked about in the film about how he felt that the final Wings tour was so doomed. He had nightmares about it, and thought they were way too under rehearsed. And it was great to see footage of the rehearsal where Paul was trying to work out how to play the song with a little luck live, and I could tell that he was nervous about it and felt terrible because it didn't sound great when they were rehearsing it. But again, if he had played that live at some point, people would have loved it. He could have worked it out, pun intended. But that's where that's where he mentions that he was told not to bring weed to Japan, but Paul being Paul and having this great weed, he brought it to Japan. And of course, when he got there, a man at the airport saw it and they had him arrested. And he was kept in a Japanese prison, I believe, for 11 days. And that was probably the most horrible time for Paul. The only time he was away from Linda throughout their entire 29 years together. He would sing songs with prisoners, play games with them. And of course, because of that, Wings broke up. The Wings tour was canceled. However, before that, he recorded a second album all on his own, McCartney 2. And that came out in April 1980. Wings was done at that point. Although it wasn't until the following year when Denny Laine quit officially from Wings. And that's about where the film ends right there. With Paul reflecting back on Wings. Oh, I do want to mention Chrissie Hynde from the Very Pretenders, a friend of Paul and Linda's. I really like the portion of the film. I love this portion about recording the song Move Tire. Now, the Move Tire was Paul's home in Scotland, this portion of land there. And he started writing this song about it. And then Denny Laine showed up, and they both worked on the song together. And then they recorded it with this Scottish pipe band with bagpipes. Always been one of my favorite songs of Paul's. That part was lovely. Now I want to mention some parts of Paul's life, or I should say parts of Wings that were not in the film that I wish were in there. There wasn't much discussion on the Wildlife album, the first Wings album. There's so much they could have talked about in there. They could have discussed Paul's concept for the album, the sessions, playing with these new guys. None of that was mentioned. We saw the cover briefly, but there was no talk about it. He could have talked about Red Rose Speedway more. Well, at all. He didn't mention it at all. The second Wings album. He could have talked about all the material he had for that album, because it was supposed to be a double album, but the record label EMI said we don't want a double album because the first one sold so poorly. I don't know why. Maybe Paul doesn't remember that story at all because he is in his 80s, but that would have... I guess I get why that wasn't mentioned, because Paul doesn't want to reflect on bad parts of that. There wasn't too much in there about the London Town album at all. And I wish he had mentioned more about recording that album on these on these on these boats, on these yachts where they made the album. It would have been cool to get a perspective about recording the album on a fucking boat with a studio in it, but that wasn't discussed here at all. I really did like all the footage of Paul, Linda, and Wings in the studio and doing interviews. There was a lot of footage of them just goofing around and being silly. That was cool because it made you see that they were that they didn't take themselves too seriously, which is nice to see. I think that's true about all four Beatles. Is that they had times when they were just goofy and being silly. I Yeah, there's not much in this film about the Venus and Mars album either. A little bit. I'd say it focuses more on Paul's personal life and the live stuff as opposed to the making of the albums. I would have liked more of that. Overall, I'd probably give this film a B plus or A minus. I just didn't love the historical revisionism part of it, where Paul ignored um, why Denny Sywell and Herman McCulloch quit Wings. It's not mentioned in this book, and it's not mentioned in the film either. And I, yeah, I would have liked more focus on the other members of Wings, Sywell and Herman McCulloch, and I mean Denny Sywell is still alive, and we know that he's reconciled with Paul years ago, and they're friends again now. And he did get some good reviews in the film. I wish he had given more, though. I really, really loved hearing Stella McCartney and Mary McCartney talking about their mom and their dad in this film. But again, it is very odd that James McCartney, Paul's son, didn't give any interviews here. He was only about 1, 2 years old when he was still around. But yeah, it would have been nice. Um, yeah, I did love how the film ended. Oh, the film ended after discussion about John's unfortunate murder on December 9th, 1980, and then Paul's reaction to that. And yeah, Sean Lennon is quoted in this book and in the film defending Paul at that moment because there's that terrible interview from some journalist who just put the microphone in Paul's face and asked Paul about what he thought about John getting killed. And Paul just says, "Oh, I heard on a phone call this morning. Oh, it's a drag, isn't it?" And people took that way out of context back then and thought Paul seems so callous about his friend just getting killed. But Sean says in the book and in the film that he could tell by Paul's eyes that he was in a terrible state and wasn't really comprehending what had just happened. And of course, if you interview someone about their best friend dying, they're not going to have the best response, and they may not have the most profound thing to say. If it's someone who's not scripting everything they say, so it was unfair to judge Paul for that, which they did. And of course, the film ends with Paul just talking with Morgan Neville, the director, present day Paul from 2025, 83-year-old Paul, reflecting on his life and his songs. And he asked Paul about this jacket that he wore in the 70s and 73, I think it was. Yeah, it was the jacket for the TV special. And he showed Paul the robot that I mentioned that was on the tour with him in 79. And then he asked Paul about Maybe I'm Amazed, the classic song about Linda that he wrote after she helped get him out of his depression when the Beatles broke up. And Paul, being Paul, can still play that on the piano. And he played 1985 on the piano. It was lovely. It's nice. It's nice seeing Paul, present day, 83 Paul, reflect back on 35-year-old Paul. I wish the film had been a bit more detailed on the members of Wings and the albums and talked about songs more. He did mention in the film that he couldn't pay the guys in Wings a good wage for their work in the band. Now, knowing the history, I know that was because Paul's money was tied up with the Apple company, and Paul wouldn't say that in the film. He just says, "Oh, I wasn't really in charge of the money end of the band." I wish he had mentioned why he couldn't do that for them. But we saw a lot of great footage in this film that we didn't really see before. We saw footage of Paul at the piano in his home when he was writing the song All of You that he was going to give to Peggy Lee to record. So we saw some amazing stuff in this film. Yeah. I just wish Linda was here to see this. I think everything Linda did with Paul is vindicating this film. It doesn't matter that she wasn't the most talented musician ever, or the talented musician singer ever. She was there in the band, and she belonged there in the band. Now, like I said before, it's fascinating who gets interviewed in the film and in the book, and who does not. Paul's stepdaughter Heather, adopted daughter Heather, is not interviewed in the book at all, or the film, and she's been basically just hiding, not in the public eye for the past 25 years. Mary and Stella are in here. And it was good that for each year of Paul in the 70s, the film captured his emotional state. In 70, he was nervous about the Beatles breaking up and what to do next. But he knew he had to break up the band legally, which he did. By 71, he was frustrated about his albums not selling well, about Ram not selling well. And the critics still hated his work because they were biased against it, wrongfully thinking he broke up the Beatles. And then he hears John release this song that's critical of him in ridiculous ways. Then by 72, he's excited because the band goes on the road. And they had a great time. By 73, he records Back to Band on the Run. It's a huge success. 74, he gets 2 new band members. By 75, he releases an album, Venus and Mars, with those 2 new members. By 76, Paul is the only Beatle to do a successful world tour. George tried that in 74, and it was a flop. Ringo didn't tour at all until 89 with the All-Star Band. John sadly didn't get the tour ever. He wanted to, but we know what happened after that. And just, Paul was on top of the world in 76. And then in 77, when punk rock, which I hate, by the way, I hate punk rock, was at the height of popularity, Paul didn't try to emulate punk rock. Instead, he released this song, this Scottish song about the Mulfkintyre, and that was the best-selling single in England of all time. Mulfkintyre. It's amazing. Then by 78, he's not really sure himself because he has to get 2 new members of the band again. And it's mentioned in the film that Paul felt uncomfortable with the final version of Wings. I don't really know why. But Linda and Paul both felt that the final iteration of the band was not that great. I disagree. You can hear how great they were on the Back to the Egg album and the single Goodnight Tonight. I feel so bad for Lawrence and Steve that Paul would say that. But that's why he got busted for pot in Japan on purpose, because he wanted to break up the band, and he wasn't, I guess he wasn't mature enough to just tell them he wanted to break up. Anyway, those are all my thoughts on the amazing documentary Man on the Run. So thank you for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments. Like, share, and subscribe.